Well, thank you for joining me today, Mike.
Thank you, Mark. Good morning.
So just briefly, maybe a quick introduction. Where are you at? What's your role? And then we can dive into the case.
Absolutely. Thanks. So my name is Michael Peterson. I'm the president and CEO of Androscoggin Valley Hospital. We're a critical access hospital in northern New Hampshire, part of North Country Healthcare, which is one of 3 critical access hospitals within the system. We basically cover all of Coos County, some far western Maine, far eastern Vermont as well, and all the way up to the Canadian border.
So we're going to talk about a situation that you dealt with as the president and CEO, recruiting a physician. So So what was the situation?
Sure, thank you. So we'll give you a little background. So this was an ED physician opening that we had, and I say we because it was a jointly recruited position between AVH and one of our sister hospitals, Upper Connecticut Valley Hospital. I'll call them UCVH. It just rolls off the tongue easier. So one of the benefits and advantages of being a part of the system is when we each need a half a doctor, we're able to combine that search so that we're able to look for a full-time doc as opposed to a part-time doc. And your students may not realize this, but in northern New Hampshire, especially in probably rural United States, it's far easier to recruit a full-time position than a part-time position. So by combining these two needs, we were able to post a full-time position and go searching for an ED doc. So both us, AVH and UCVH, needed an ED provider. We have already, as a system, established what's called a centralized medical staff office. That means one group of people do the process of credentialing and privileging. And I'll get into the difference between those two because it's relevant to this case. The system credentials and processes all applications for privileges. The credentialing is actually what we do to verify an applicant is who they say they are. It's, did they really go to medical school? Where did they go to medical school? Do they have the grades? Do they have the expertise and the proficiency, the competence to do what they say they want to do for us? As opposed to privileging, which is the responsibility of each hospital's local board. Privileging is granting permission to a credentialed provider to actually do what they have applied to do for us. So the local board, and many may not understand this, the Board of Trustees is actually the ultimate authority and ultimately responsible for ensuring quality at a nonprofit healthcare organization. That includes approving applications for privileges of providers. Now, that is a daunting task, and many boards of trustees are made up of non-clinicians. So these are lay people representing the community. So they delegate the authority to review and applications and grant privileges to the leadership of the medical staff. And that's done through credentials committees, medical executive committees, and ultimately they report up to the board. The board blesses and approves any application for privileges. So that's just some background. We'll call him Dr. Jones to protect the innocent here. Dr. Jones had applied for this shared position for the 2 hospitals. He was going to be doing a number of regular shifts at UCVH and be doing some per diem work at AVH. So per diem is basically just we use them as we need them if there was a backfill or somebody called in sick or is on vacation or at a conference or whatever. But ultimately, we have enough opportunities for per diems that we could make up a full-time equivalent. And an FTE for our system is basically 7 24-hour shifts a month. So he's going to be doing 4 for sure up to the UCVH and 3 up to 3 or a little bit over per month at AVH, which makes us FTE. So the interviews happened. We got applicants. We found Dr. Jones. The interviews went great. And of course, one of the obvious questions you would ask in any interview is, why are you leaving the place you were at? And again, for protection purposes, we'll say he came from a hospital down south, leave it at that. And the originating hospital had just been acquired by a for-profit entity. So this was a nonprofit hospital that had been purchased for whatever reason by one of the for-profit entities, a big national firm. As such, the ED staff, the emergency doctors, were then outsourced to another subcontractor or another for-profit entity.
Which is a common thing, right? I mean, it's
It is
common for ED services to be provided by a ED practice.
correct. There are a number of them all over the country. They're usually pretty large firms, and they are, make no doubt about it, though, for-profit. So their motivation is a little different. As such, Dr. Jones shared with us that after that happened, that shift happened, the culture began to shift. And he said you could really tell that it was motivated more about the bottom line and the profit versus the quality of care, the service delivered, and so forth. I'm not here to debate the values of either. I'm just saying, he said, it didn't fit for me anymore. So that's why he decided to leave, which, by the way, also is a very common story. You know, we actually have picked up others, docs, who had said, look, once that change happened, it doesn't fit with my sense of values anymore. So we completed the references, and they were all good responses. As such, both hospitals agreed, and we made him an offer. He accepted the offer, and the contract was signed. And immediately upon signing the contract, that's when we kick into gear the application for privileges. Okay, so the medical staff office, once they get word that a contract is signed, then they start doing their research and verifying board of licensure, verifying the medical school, the transcripts or volumes to make sure he's competent and in all these things he says he's going to do. So that began. That's known as the application for privileges. In the applications for privileges, when that was filed, the medical staff office just doesn't take the word for it. We follow up. Anything that may be left a little vague or incomplete or whatever, they make phone calls and chase this stuff down. That's part of the due diligence of recruiting and placing a physician. In that process, they discovered there was what's called a PIP, or a performance improvement plan. And it was made aware to our medical staff office, which, by the way, again, single medical staff office serving both hospitals. So we credential and process applications once, and again, another benefit of being a system. So the provider doesn't have to go through two sets of applications, and we can share the data throughout the system. But they uncovered there was a PIP in place. Well, unfortunately, that's something that we would want to have heard about by now. So when you're interviewing a provider, one of my standard questions is there anything going to show up when we start the application process? Anything we need to know about? Are there claims filed against you? Is there settlements, large settlements for anything? Or were there any reason you were let go from a position, or do you have a performance improvement plan in place? And all those questions were no. So
you explicitly asked him, do you have a performance improvement plan in place?
Exactly.
And he said no.
That's a standard. And he had said no. So when we uncovered this PIP, it was a red flag. And so AVH stepped back and said, whoa, there's something here. So obviously, again, we go digging. First person we talked to was Dr. Jones. Hey, what's the deal? You said you didn't have a PIP in place, and we've been reported by your former hospital that there was one in place. And he denied any awareness of it at all. He said, I don't know what you're talking about. So would you be, and to his credit, he was completely forthcoming. He said, I'll sign any release you want me to sign so we can talk to anybody we want to talk to. Because usually if they start getting kind of defensive or standoffish, that's a red flag. So we start looking at that. But no, Dr. Jones, go ahead.
Yeah, let me just interrupt for a second. What's a release? Why do you need one?
Sure, a release for contact, because the process of applying for credentials and privileges is so particular. There's a lot of legal ramifications around this, because now you're talking about the Board of Medicine and licensure, and any variation or any either denial of an application for privileges is reportable to the Board of Medicine. If they were ever terminated from a privileged facility, that's reportable to the Board of Medicine. It can change careers. So it's very particular, it's very regulated, and frankly, we have to, follow through very carefully. So we always ask for releases so that we can talk to people so we can get more information. Again, it's a great tool we can use. If we have templates that we provide to the providers, they say, yes, you can talk to anybody you want to, or don't talk to this person, or talk to that person, but not this person. But effectively, Dr. Jones gave us full rights to talk to anybody. He says, I have no idea what you're talking about. I'd love to know myself, so here you go. So we have signed release. That way, if it ever comes back that we find some information out. The provider who's applied, if they disagree, doesn't have any like legal appeal process included because he signed that release to allow us to talk to somebody. So that's why releases are important. Again, he was very forthcoming, cooperative. So we conducted interviews with the former ED medical director, and that, among others, by the way, but that medical director was the one who revealed, yes, there were multiple quality issues with Dr. Jones. There were multiple interpersonal issues, his behavior, working with nursing staff, working with colleagues, even working with patients with Dr. Jones, very recent. So we documented all of that for the record and then shared that information with the credentials committee. Dr. Jones, of course, we followed back up with and said, well, here's what they said. And can you help us understand where this is? And then he said, well, honestly, in the meantime, he had given his notice at the hospital. And he said, their attitude really changed after I gave notice. And all of a sudden, it felt like, they actually paid him out. And that's a standard practice that says, okay, your contract says you give 90 days. Thank you very much. But we're going to pay you out 90 days and you just pack your stuff and leave today. Don't come back. That happens from time to time. It's not very common, but usually it means there's some sort of issue. But Dr. Jones questioned whether or not this was retaliation for his notice, because he again declared, I had no record of this. It turns out in that follow-up call Dr. Jones had with his former boss, that he was made aware at that time that 2 days following his notice, they put a performance improvement plan in place. If you think about it, the intent of a performance improvement plan is to communicate issues, put a plan together, and allow somebody to actually work the plan to improve. I mean, it's right in the name. Right. He, of course, had no option to do that because he gave his notice already. They said, we're going to pay you out, and then they put the plan in place. So it really doesn't, affect, it didn't have any ability to affect his practice at that facility. Right. So the question was this retaliation? And so, of course, we heard that, factored that into the interview, and found that there was no prior record of any quality or behavioral issues prior to this PIP. Okay, the guy had been there for 5 years, and it was only, according to the PIP, within the last 6 months that he had any complaints or issues. But again, he was never made aware of any complaints before he gave notice. So that all went to our credentials committee. And as you can imagine, the credentials committee had some questions. Now, the credentials committee is made up of all physicians, and their job is to pour through every application and take a look at, okay, does this look like something we strategically need? We had an ED physician opening, that obviously that was a no-brainer. And are they qualified? So Dr. Jones was a board-certified emergency medicine physician, so clearly qualified. And all the documentation we had from the medical staff office was, yeah, he went to school where he said he went to school. He worked where he said he worked. There were no issues, but what's this PIP? So he said, well, a PIP, why, do we have to deal with this? Let's dig into this a bit. Laid out all of the rest of the documentation of the interviews we had conducted. And herein lies the crux. Normally, this would be a little more straightforward, but because this was a shared position and because the local boards, which mean the local credentials committee of each hospital, are responsible for approving the privileges, we found out at the same time that our sister hospital had already approved his privileges. Oh. So now it gets political, right? Mm-hmm. So one system, 2 hospitals, 1 board committee has already approved the privileges. Our committee has said, wait a minute, is this now fait accompli? Do we have to approve these privileges just because the other hospital has? Yeah. So some things to consider in that one, which we did at the credentials committee, was our intent to use Dr. Jones was on a per diem basis, not regular part-time as it was at UCVH. So the likelihood that he was going to be working here was high, but as a per diem, one of the things we could opt to do if we determined that we don't really want him working here would be to just not schedule him, right? So that means that he's approved for privileges, but wouldn't be working here. So the question became what to do. and we considered a number of options. Bear in mind that a couple of these options have significant impact to this provider's permanent medical board record. So withdrawing an application is one way to avoid having to report to the medical board, the Board of Licensure. If we ask a provider to withdraw an application and they do so, then it's not reportable. They can move on, and future applications, they don't have to mention us at all, okay? Versus a denied application. If we deny an application, that is reportable to the medical board, and from that point on, every single time that provider applies for privileges anywhere, there's a question on the application that says, have you ever been denied privileges at a medical facility? He would have to check yes. That's a huge red flag to most credentials committees, most boards. And again, it could be career changing. So we are very, very careful about that. The other is the legal ramifications. When you deny an application, you immediately go into this whole long, expensive legal process of appeals and hearings, and basically the only winners there are lawyers. So what to do? So we looked at it as three options, actually four options. First one is roll the dice. Take a chance. This smells like it could be a witch hunt. It could be retaliatory based on all the data we had, but it's a chance. The impact of that is, what if it isn't? What if there really are quality issues? All he had to do was work one shift, touch one patient, and if caused harm, our reputation's at stake, and worse, a person could be harmed, right? So,
and could it also be brought? I mean, in this case, could a malpractice lawyer say, "Well, you knew he had a PIP and you hired him anyway"?
Correct. Then we would be found liable and negligent, because it's the reasonable test. You should have known would be the case, especially if we've got all this documentation. Okay, and we moved ahead anyway. So option one is roll the dice. Option two would be to ask the applicant, Dr. Jones in this case, to withdraw his application based on this finding and the incongruency of the reports. He said, I had no idea that there was any problem. I only learned about after I gave notice. And, the originating hospital said, no, he's had problems for 6 months, and now he's got this plan of action. So there was incongruency there. So based on that, we could have asked him to withdraw. The impact of that, of course, is we have to go back to the well in terms of recruiting for a physician. That means we'd have to probably pay a locums or a traveler provider, which is usually 1.5 times as expensive. And frankly, locums or travelers, they don't have the same investment in the community. So you're kind of rolling the dice on quality there as well. And then the politics of it, with one system hospital approving the application and another asking for withdrawal. I mean, that sets up some kind of, it's non-standard across the system. So there's some implications there. The third one would be to request or approve conditional privileges. This is an approval with some specific conditions or tasks or observation requirements. That is a pretty common practice, but it's only in certain cases where we could say, for this period of time, we'll grant you privileges as requested, but this is what you have to do in the meantime. But the impact of that, of course, is the provider may feel, well, why are you holding me to a different standard than somebody else? Or this is a witch hunt, and why are you, holding me to account on this when I've done nothing wrong. So there could be some resentment. They could bail. They could withdraw their application if we requested conditional privileges. They can, at their behest, anytime pull their application, which leaves us back to the impact of what I said earlier. And then it's time. I mean, you've got to have other people do things, right? It's either medical staff office or a preceptor or whatever. I mean, it's an investment in time. The fourth option would be to just flat out deny the application. And I've already spoken about a number of those impacts. So those were really the four options that the Credentials Committee considered when dealing with Dr. Jones.
All right. So we'll pause here and let the students think about what to do next.
Okay.
And we pause, and so we can just dive in. So I'll cut the recording at that point.
Okay. Is there anything you want me to kind of elaborate on that we covered that that could set up the kind of the basis for discussion?
I do have one quick question for you because I don't know the answer, and that was if you give someone conditional privileges, does that go in their permanent record that they were privileged with conditional, or is that a transparent?
That's an internal process all over. If you think about the application or what's reportable, they applied for privileges and they were granted. Okay. Now, the risk there for conditional privileges is if they don't meet the requirements, and then we don't grant permanent privileges. The standard process for privileging is we put everybody on a provisional period for 1 year. Mm-hmm. So it's common to have preceptors. But if after that year there's issues, what more often than not happens is then we put somebody on a PIP. Mm-hmm. And they are involved in the process, and then we basically say we're going to extend your provisional period for up to 6 months or even a year, but this is the things you need to do.
Okay.
So effectively, conditional privileges is moving that PIP to the very front end.
I see. What I mean? Got it. Mm-hmm.
So, and then ultimately, if somebody fails a PIP, we could either terminate their contract with cause, or terminate their contract without cause, or not grant reapplications. All of those things are reportable. So,
terminations.
Withdrawing, or most of the time when we lose a provider for cause, and if the cause is quality, we have a coterminous clause in our contracts that says you're automatically withdrawing privileges, so it doesn't necessarily get reported to the Board of Medicine. If there's quality issues, however, that are reported, then we terminate privileges. Then they do have to check the box. Yes, I've been terminated from privileges or denied application. So it's significant. You know what I mean? So we really try to do our best job up front because you don't want to inherit problems.
Right.
And then we try to make sure that anything that requires going to a PIP is very clear and they have a chance for success.
Yeah.
Okay.
Great. All right. So we'll come back and